Okay, good afternoon, Sean.
Hey, good afternoon, Ben.
You're in a hotel, but that hotel is in Ukraine. Where are you?
Yeah, I'm in the capital in Kyiv. Unfortunately, it's a wet and miserable day outside. I'd have tried to set up a cafe to give you a better view behind me, but unfortunately, connectivity isn't all it should be out here at the moment.
Ah,
Particularly last night, there were air raid warnings going off, and I slept through them. So, but
of
yeah,
course.
it's all go
Yeah.
out here.
Well, you're there. I'm not in the studio. I'm in my study, as you can see, with all my paraphernalia around me. So, Sean, the UK under Prime Minister Keir Starmer appears want to go on. He's going to give Ukraine 3 billion a year until it's done, which could be 100 years. The EU are getting more and more strident, particularly Ursula von der Leyen. They seem to want war, apart from Hungary and Italy and maybe one or two others. And even Putin now seems to want war as he's not playing ball. The only people who seem to want peace are President Trump and Vladimir Zelensky.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating walking the streets out here. I've had a whole series of meetings. A bit like last time I was out in October. I know quite a few more people now, and I guess the question that keeps cropping up is, what is President Trump doing? You know, the Ukrainians can't actually get their heads around why America was their best ally for the last 3 years, and then all of a sudden it's become what feels like an enemy and is now a friend to their enemy. In other words, cozying up to Putin. I mean, the short version, we can probably get into this, but the short version clearly is that it feels like Trump has sort of bullied Zelensky into being at the table. But that's fine. But how do you get President Putin to the table? Putin is winning the war bluntly on the ground. He's on the front foot. He's watched the Americas almost look as if it's abandoning Ukraine. And therefore, probably Putin feels that he's got a green light to go and achieve his full objectives. So really difficult to see where that leaves us at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the way I read it, which could be entirely wrong, a few weeks ago, it seemed to me like Putin was ready to talk. Now, so what is he doing? Well, there's at least two options. One is he's playing a negotiating game, he's playing hardball. Or secondly, which would be absolutely atrocious, he feels he's now got more advantage than he had before militarily. He's just taken another key town in the Kursk region. Maybe he's feeling a bit emboldened. I mean, I'd hate if that were the truth, but are there any other options?
Well, unfortunately, I'm a bit with you there. I mean, unfortunately, as a military guy, history suggests that ceasefires only work if both sides are at stalemate or one side's won and the other side's lost, and that's not where we are at the moment. Why would Putin stop? I mean, let's go back 3 years. You know, Putin thought he was going to walk into Ukraine, and remember that 40-mile convoy. Everybody
Yeah.
thought that Ukraine would fall in a matter of days. Here we are 3 years later, and Putin has had a lot of those ambitions squashed. But he is winning the grinding war of attrition. And if his ambition is still just a land bridge, he's almost there. The problem is, whenever I speak to Ukrainians out here, I spoke to one this morning. I did an interview with the Ukrainian television channel this morning, and they basically looked at me and said, "You do realize that Putin will never accept a sovereign Ukraine. He'll never accept Ukraine having its own voice, its own culture. That is not something he's going to accept. So he's not going to stop until Ukraine is subjugated. And therefore, whilst he may have to have a pause for a year or two to recharge the batteries, he is not about to give up on that ambition. And therefore, they see this whole Trump initiative at the moment to get peace as all very well. But actually, if you're putting a sticky plaster over this, it will get ripped off in a couple of years' time. And therefore, the only way Zelensky can accept any form of peace if this cast iron security guarantees around it. And of course, America won't talk about that. Europe is desperately trying to step up to the plate. And that goes to your point about Ursula von der Leyen and the Europeans going, well, how on earth would we do that?
Hmm. Well, it's tricky, isn't it? Because both sides seem to be true, or both things seem to be true. Yeah, I mean, there's bound to be a feeling, a strong feeling based on all sorts of history and understanding of Putin's character that ultimately he's never going to give in. But secondly, we want the meat grinder to stop, don't we?
Well,
So what do you do? Do you say no, we're going to carry on with war because we're going to beat Putin at his own game, we're going to win the war of attrition and that'll be the end of it. I'll never want to do it again. I mean, that's not likely either, is it?
No, and I think where the line about, nobody wants to see the killing, everyone wants to see it stop. I mean, nobody wants a war. Nobody wants the First World War. Nobody wants the Second World War. The trouble is that we don't live in an idealistic world. And, Putin invaded Ukraine. Putin has continued to push forward at huge cost, both to the Russian army, but also to the North Koreans, and worst, through to Ukraine. And the question is then, how do you bring it to a halt? The international community might well breathe a sigh of relief if a ceasefire was brought in now. The trouble is, unless you solve the problem, Putin will just rearm. He's learned a lot of lessons and come back for another bite of the cherry. And I think that's the challenge at the moment, is that I think Zelensky and Ukraine, the feeling I get, I mean, clearly I can't do a dip test for the whole of Ukraine, but I'm talking to a lot of people out here, and there's an overwhelming sense that they are weary of the war, that the sacrifice has been huge. Even though I walked out in the city this morning, bought a coffee, and it's bustling and everything's busy, but there's really difficult, somber reminders all around you of the huge price to be paid here. And therefore, I think Ukraine would be prepared to cede some territory, but it absolutely has to find some sort of security guarantees beyond that. And at the moment, Putin absolutely will not let them have those security guarantees, because that closes off his ambition.
Well, we have this hypothesis, and you might be right today, which is it's 15:03 in the UK. On the 13th of March. Tomorrow, Putin's response might be different. So sitting here in my cozy office, I guess what I'd be thinking is, let's hope and pray that Putin and Trump, and it will require, whatever people say about Trump cozying up to Putin, it is going to require a conversation. Let's hope for now something positive and quick comes from that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, where I agree with you is that there is a logic that says that the war for Ukraine is an unwinnable war now. And if you subscribe to the view that Ukraine will not be able to push Russia out of the occupied territories or Crimea, then you might believe the view that the more you fuel the fire, the more you extend the conflict. And therefore, and I think that's what President Trump's doing. Now, what he is therefore doing is testing the resolve. He's brought President Zelensky to the table by using a number of different methods to coerce, encourage, force, whatever your adjective you might want to use. The challenge he's now laid at President Putin's door is, do you want to actually find an off-ramp? There is a view that an off-ramp might be helpful to President Putin, however difficult we may see that in the UK, and therefore he is making overtures to offer that off-ramp. I think it'll be fascinating to see, though, whether Trump's bluff is called or whether Putin turns around and says no. Now, the first impression we're getting from his officials is, no, we're not interested in any form of ceasefire. I'll be really interested to see then what President Trump does, because in effect, he has forced one side of the table. If he doesn't have influence to force the other side, how does he bring that war to an end? What can he do? And there's some really interesting options, I think, on the table there.
Well, sure, I've said this a number of times before. You're in Ukraine. I'll give Zelensky a little call. Maybe he'll bring you to the table and you can sort of help them work their way through it. I've been privileged, but I've been slightly serious, because I think it requires people who are not stuck in the middle of it all. Trump's got an electorate to face up to. Putin's got the same. There are a lot of conflicting political objectives and issues. Zelensky's got the end of war. Then there's going to be elections. It's the end of martial law, which he's now promising. He's probably thinking he's not going to do too well in elections. So, it seems to me like we need some external set of forces to bash heads together.
I'm with you there. I mean, the parallels here with Gaza, the Israelis and the Hamas are visceral hatred. They need other people to enable that conversation. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that you're in exactly the same sort of position between, Russia and Ukraine. Where I think I struggle slightly here is that, President Trump keeps talking about a deal. he famously said to Zelensky, "You don't have any cards," and President Zelensky tried to say, "You do realize this is not a card game. This is lives." And actually, the danger is that Trump is only focused on bringing the war to an end, and that actually may not be something that provides Ukraine with the long-term security. I know we've had this conversation before, but when you meet people here, they're very polite, but they do turn around and say, "Look, the last time the UK guaranteed our sovereignty, 1994, Budapest Memo, we signed up to it, we gave up our nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
If we'd still had those today, would we be in this position today? We cannot accept any form of written agreement here. We've got to have more than that."
So would this work then? Again, I speak not as anybody who's had any experience of doing this sort of thing, but as you say, there are some politically practical things that can be done. So, for instance, by all accounts, Trump has done a deal with Zelensky. I don't know how many times Zelensky can give away the mineral rights to these rare earth minerals, but he's offered, I think it's half to America as part of this deal. That means America is going to have to protect. That's a lot of money over a long period of time for some very critical industries in the US. So Trump could argue, I've got to protect this, so I'm going to put a base to protect our investment in Ukraine. That it would be a very big thing to do for Putin to then attack Ukraine with US actually there as a partner militarily, wouldn't it?
Well, I think what's been interesting about this whole conversation is about those security guarantees. So there's a couple of things here. One of which was always, what about the territories that Russia has seized? It's almost certain Ukraine will never accept that they're Russian, but under law they can still claim rights, but actually no longer, but they could still agree some sort of peace pending solution of that. The other issue is this long-term security guarantee. And although the US has said no, what you're saying is that with mineral rights, if you've got a lot of American contractors working on the ground in Ukraine, if they came under attack, that then surely America would rush their rescue. I think at the moment, it will be very difficult for Trump to go further than he has on the military side, because in effect, he is turning around and saying, "Look, Europe, this is your problem. This is not my problem. My problem is China. You have not stepped up to the plate, Europe. You have not been paying your dues for NATO. This is on your doorstep. It's not on ours. Deal with it." And I do think that's where we've seen our Prime Minister talking about potentially boots on the ground, potentially a no-fly zone. I was talking to somebody in their MOD here in Kyiv earlier on today that was talking about this Sky Shield initiative, which is a sort of no-fly zone, but internationally. And there's a lot of momentum behind what might that look like. How do you get as many countries involved as possible? It limits the risk with boots on the ground, but it does provide some form of credibility in terms of a deterrent for Russia having another bite of the cherry. But I don't know what the answer will look like. What I do know is Europe is struggling now because it knows it's not been paying enough on defense the last few years. Now Russia is a threat. And the triple whammy is that America now no longer appears to be the guarantor of security in Europe. So all of a sudden, Europe's going, we've got to fill up our own weapons stores before we then provide any excess capacity to Ukraine. How do you square that in the near term?
Well, I heard a disgusting statistic the other day that if you add up, I mean, restoring your storehouse is about a lot of shells and bullets as well as some other stuff. Yeah? I heard a story the other day that if you add up the number of I think it was shells or bullets, one of the two. If you add up the number of shells that America can produce in a year, and you add up the number that Europe can produce in a year, it's less than what Russia is producing already. Now, if that's true, then as you've just said, both countries, for a lot of reasons, possibly because they're giving a load away, it's got a long way to go. Just to, and I think Greg was saying this, wasn't he? Air Marshal Greg was saying this a couple of weeks ago. They've got a long way to go in terms of how they spend their budget just to catch up to where they were before, or to arrive at something which might be, good resistance for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's slightly worse than that as well. Bluntly, bullets and artillery shells are the weapons of attritional warfare, where force on the battlefield. One of the things that the West has tried to do is to move on from that method of warfare and use technology, long-range missiles, long-range strikes, intelligence-driven operations, that sort of thing. And that's where we've been supporting Ukraine with a lot of those high-tech weapons and capability. The trouble is they're very expensive. We didn't have many of them, and therefore they pretty quickly run out. And unlike shells and bullets, yes, if you wanted to have the same size pile as the Russians, we've got a long way to go. But what we've seen on the battlefields is Russia is very happy to do that Second World War attritional warfare. High casualties, they just don't care. I'm not sure that's the method of war that we want to be prepared to do. Yes, we've got to have some of those artillery shells, but actually we do need to invest in these missiles, rockets, high-tech equipment. And that's something which our defense industry is not configured to produce in the sort of quantities we need. And we haven't got the money to do it either, and we're short of those weapons. All of those things are happening when, bluntly, our Prime Minister said we're going to go up to 2.5%, but as you and I have discussed, it's actually a reduction overall because of the nuclear deterrent being replaced. The fact is that the Chagos Islands are now going to, some of the funding for that coming out of the defence budget, and about 3 billion to Ukraine.
Yeah, well, he's not actually admitted that it's going, the Chagos Islands is part of the budget, but I think given that he's resisted answering the question, or he sort of danced around the head of a pin, you're probably right. But, you know, Sean, buried in what you just said over the last few minutes are at least a couple of options that the adults, including Zelensky, the adults could formulate a plan. So I'm sure, you know, okay, you live this and breathe this at the moment, but if you can come up with, you know, 2 or 3 sort of practically sounding solutions, I'm sure greater people than us, given the days they've got and the weeks, can come up with something.
Yeah, I think where I'm a little bit more pessimistic is that, go back to the question, why did Putin launch this attack? Because actually, aligned with that question is what's going to happen to Belarus. We've seen pictures today of Putin meeting the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. And by all accounts, Belarus would fall in a heartbeat because Russia already really controls it. Georgia
actually need a gun to be fired.
No, exactly. And Georgia is another one. And so actually this is about President Putin just redefining the Soviet Union, recapturing the Soviet Union. And if that's what he intends to do, our efforts at appeasement, by sort of pausing him along the way, is probably doing nothing more than giving him breathing space to rearm, ready for the next bite of the cherry. So in that sort of grand strategic sense, I always worry about what history books will write about this period. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that unless you get to the bottom of, at the moment, if a deal was done with Russia today, Putin would go back to his people and declare victory. I have achieved my place in history. I have brought back some of our territories back under our control. And he will set an example for his successor or potentially for him in a few years' time. I think we've got to find a way of ensuring that an aggressor who wants to achieve political objectives by force recognizes that that is folly, that will never succeed in a civilized world. At the moment, I think we risk that not being the case. And that's a profound worry for me.
Okay, so that has to be achieved, however you do it, but the war has to stop.
Yeah, and I agree. But the reason I pick you up on the war has to stop, I think, everybody will agree the war has to stop. The question is, if you simply stop it today but don't solve the problems, it will come back tomorrow and it'll come back worse. So do you... one of the options I think that's on the table out here at the moment, which is being discussed a bit more widely, watch back 2 years ago, the UK and the Europeans did not want to get involved in the war. Gradually, we've had our fingers in the mangle of providing, anti-tank weapons, then tanks, then long-range strike weapons, now F-16s and Mirages. But we've not put boots on the ground. We've not put a no-fly zone in place. We've done enough to keep Ukraine-ish in the fight, but not enough to protect it and stop it going forward. I think what's shaken the West now is the Trump position And all of a sudden, if Ukraine was to fall, that would be now Russia on our European border and a grave threat. And therefore, there are now politicians starting to talk about potentially muscling up and actually meeting force with force. That would be a far more compelling. It'll be an escalation. I accept there are risks there, but my goodness, it would send a powerful message to Putin that if you try to do this again, we will meet force with force. At the moment, he's intimidating the West, and we are stepping backwards rather than meeting him toe to toe.
Okay, if that happens, that'll have to be part of the peace plan, as opposed to we'll agree the peace, and then next day we put 25,000 soldiers in.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a sequencing thing here, and that's why I think it's fascinating to see. I struggle to understand what Trump is doing at the moment, abandoning the policy of being the best friend to Ukraine for the last few years, and then suddenly cozying up to Putin. What happened to, the principles of freedom of speech, democracy, and alignment against tyranny? But if this is part of a game just to call Putin's bluff, to see actually does Putin want an off ramp? If Putin turns that down, then he is pretty clear what his maximalist objectives are, and then I think that raises questions for what are we going to do about it? Do we just let him do it because we don't want a war, or do we actually stand firm? And I think I'm inevitably going to say this because I'm an ex-military guy who studies a lot of military history. Many chapters of our history are written that show the earlier you combat these threats, the less difficult it is to stop them. The longer you leave it, the longer a route of appeasement, the far more difficult it becomes and far more costly, both in terms of blood and treasure. And therefore, I think there is a really interesting conundrum facing the West at the moment. If Putin, as expected, is not interested in having any form of ceasefire at the moment, what does the West do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, that's today. Maybe tomorrow we'll have a different story.
I hope so. But I'm always looking for the lines of consistency here. And Putin, remember, when the war started, I remember a lot of people saying, "Oh, Putin's mad. He's stupid, taking the war." I don't subscribe to that view. You've got to find out what it is that's motivating him. And I don't think he wants a war. I think it's pretty clear what he wants to achieve. And are we prepared to stop him achieving that, or are we prepared to let him subjugate Ukraine? And that's fascinating questions that, will be some who turn around and say it's not worth a war, let him walk through Ukraine. When you're in the city, as I am at the moment, you walk around and these people are you and I. They speak a different language, but they have families, they have loved ones, they go about their work, they look after their elderly, they have children, and therefore the danger is if you stand by as somebody gets beaten up on the street corner, what happens when you're the one being beaten up? And I think there are some, it's a fascinating challenge facing our politicians, but it's pretty clear at the moment that Putin is winning and he's being a bully on the world stage, and it's working.